Muito boa tarde, vamos dar início à sessão da tarde. Durante a parte da manhã tivemos a oportunidade de ouvir 4 intervenções, 2 de natureza, digamos, mais teórica e 2 estudos de caso, ou 3 estudos de caso sobre Portugal. E agora, durante a parte da tarde, vamos dedicar esta sessão ao estudo de 4 pequenos e médios Estados, a Holanda, a Suécia, a Irlanda e a Dinamarca. A primeira intervenção será feita pelo professor Rob Defe, que é diretor do Centro de Estudos Estratégicos de Haia, desde 1999, que é professor de Relações Internacionais na Academia Militar da Holanda, em Breda, e é também professor de Estudos Estratégicos na Universidade de Leiden desde 2000. Professor Rob Defe, the floor is yours, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the Netherlands. What I would like to do is talk about the background of Dutch foreign and defense policies. And that means that I need to go back in history a couple of centuries, but I will do that very briefly because this history has, of course, shaped Dutch political and strategic culture. And it guides the way we deal with international security challenges right now. After that, I would like to say something about the present time. At present, NATO of the Netherlands is still struggling with the legacy of a political crisis which started in 2001 when... is something wrong?
There's a problem with the sound. They can't hear well.
You can't hear me? Is that because I don't talk too loud, or is it because something else? Is it a technical problem? Technical problem. Let's then wait a couple of seconds. Yes? Yeah, I can. I think it's louder now. Yeah, right. Okay, so what I will do is talk a little bit about the background, history, the political strategic culture of the Netherlands, which is still important for today's policies. Talk a little bit about today, and the Netherlands is still struggling with the legacy of a political crisis that started in 2002 when a politician was murdered in my country. Then I will talk a little bit about defense policies and the whole restructuring process the Netherlands went through, which started after the end of the Cold War, and then I conclude, of course, with some conclusions and a small look forward. So first, then the background of Dutch foreign policy. I think it's useful to quote a work by a famous Dutch scholar, which happened to be also Minister of Defense not so long ago, Joris Voorhoeven, and he once characterized Dutch foreign policy as policies based on peace, profit, and principles. To put it in another way, we like peace, we like stability in the world, because without stability our economy can't prosper. So for that reason, we like profits. The Netherlands economy has always been very strong, and from the early days, we always were a trade nation, and we try to get some money. And our foreign policy is also based on principles. In other words, we, the Dutch, know what is good for the world. It is based on moral ideas about how the world should function. What is also important is that there is some specific Dutch idea of doing business and dealing with each other in the Netherlands itself, and that's called our famous polder model. We talk forever, and then all of a sudden, after lengthy conversations, we have a conclusion and we have policies. But usually this is done by talking and talking forever. And this this idea of doing business with each other emerged in the 17th century already. In those days, believe it or not, the Netherlands was a superpower. It was the most powerful nation on earth, and we fought our wars, and we even defeated the UK in those days. Not that we are very proud of it today, because most people simply don't know that anymore. But a couple of 100 years ago, the Netherlands was important. And but some of the themes which are still there in Dutch foreign policy, they emerged in those days. For example, we didn't want to participate in the international power struggle. That is something the Dutch didn't want to do. Why not? Because if you fight wars, and you fight wars other than protecting your trade interests, but you fight war for power in the world, then it will lead to unstable international relations, and that is not good for the trade. So we always emphasize trade profits above power struggle, and we still do so. But that was already the case when the Netherlands was a kind of superpower. Moreover, in those days, the Netherlands had no strong centralized leadership. That is also typical Dutch. No strong central leadership. The Netherlands in those days, in the 17th century, was a group of cities and provinces without strong leaders. We were a republic in those days. After that we became a monarchy, but also the monarch had no power whatsoever. Even the prime minister today in the Netherlands has very limited power. Power is shared among the members of the cabinet, and that is something that goes back to the 17th century. So if you go back to those days, and you think about some of the constant factors or the recurring approaches in Dutch foreign policy, then I can mention a few. First, there is a strong legal approach. Hugo Grotius was among the founding fathers of international law, and this doesn't come as a surprise. And the reason is that strong international law helps creating a stable international environment, and again, a stable international environment is good for our trade. So this already was recognized, this principle, in the 17th century, and it is still one of the recurring themes in Dutch foreign policy. If you now look at The Hague, it's not our capital, that's Amsterdam, but The Hague is the seat of the government. The Hague calls itself a city for peace, security, safety and justice. And we try to attract as many institutions to the Netherlands in order to create this city for peace, security, safety and justice. And indeed this goes back to the 17th century. Another recurring theme is the emphasis that is put by the Netherlands on international organizations, strong international organizations, and this is of course also linked to strong international law. The reason for this is, again, stability. Stable international relations are good for our trade, and if you don't have the forces and you can't make a difference in the world with military means, then you should make a difference with international law and international institutions, because that helps us creating stability. The third approach, and that's an interesting one, is a certain degree of anti-militarism or even pacifism. On the other hand, well, the Dutch are no pacifists by nature. We fought many colonial wars, and we are now in Afghanistan fighting a war. The Netherlands is one of the few NATO countries that has a considerable amount of troops in the south of Afghanistan, and we fight the Taliban there. So we are not really pacifists, but we don't like it either. And that is something that can be found by quite a few other small and medium states. We always have a debate in the Netherlands, what our armed forces are good for. Why do we need armed forces? Do we need armed forces to protect our interests, to protect our territory? Well, the defense of our territory is not really something that should be done right now in the traditional sense, because we are not threatened by anybody. Or do we need armed forces to do good in the world? Do we need armed forces for peacekeeping operations? Now, traditionally, the left in the Netherlands, and I trust it is not very different in quite a few other countries, the left in the Netherlands always put emphasis on the armed forces as peacekeepers, while the right always put more emphasis on the war-fighting element of our armed forces. And that means that the armed forces should also be used to protect our interests. For example, today to protect our energy needs. That is something most politicians don't want to discuss in my country, but energy security is very high on the agenda internationally, and is one of the key elements right now of NATO policies. So that means that one day we may have to fight for our energy. And that could be the case if an oil-producing country or region plunges into chaos, and there is considerable instability, and we have to create some stability in order to have access to oil reserves. Then the fourth recurring approach in Dutch foreign policy is, and that is, I think, a very important one, and this morning it has been mentioned also quite a few times, for example, in the context of Portugal. The fourth recurring approach is our maritime or anti-continental focus. By definition, the Netherlands is a sea-going nation. We always try to remain independent from the major continental powers, being France and Germany, and for that reason we always played the transatlantic card. So we played that card ever since the end of the Second World War, and before that we put much emphasis on the Pax Britannica, so our relationship with the Brits. NATO, of course, became the embodiment of both, and the reason why we did is that by playing this card we could remain independent from France and Germany. Indeed, we could even have a bigger say in Europe than when we would not have this very strong alliance with the UK and the Americans. But this also goes back deep in our history. And at the same time, we try to find a way to constrain major powers in Europe through multinational arrangements and international law. In a way, the Netherlands is a status quo power. We do not want to see big changes in the world, because big changes will lead to instability. So we try to avoid that. Now the problem is that the end of the Cold War really was an era of great turmoil. So it also undermined the prospects of a status quo power in Europe. And it also weakened some of the recurring themes of Dutch foreign policy. For example, how important is the transatlantic link if at the same time, after the end of the Cold War, the US strategic focus is no longer Europe, but is shifting towards Asia, for good reasons. Then you really have a problem, because if the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana, is so important for your foreign policy, and is so important to remain independent from the major continental powers, then what will happen? What will be the consequences for your foreign policy if all of a sudden the Americans are not that interested anymore in Europe? And I must say, for good reasons, because European integration was progressing. Europe is very prosperous. Europe is supposed to be a part of the world that should deal with its own security problems, and for that reason I can clearly understand why the US is shifting position. This has led to constant debates in Dutch politics about the importance of NATO and military integration in NATO or military integration in the European Union. Most politicians, most experts in the Netherlands have always seen European integration something of a economic nature. And they were always quite reluctant to see this also in terms of military integration. But because of the shifting strategic focus of the US, it is obvious that in the Netherlands we had to think about European integration in terms of military integration. And of course that was also done. In the mid-1990s we saw a major foreign policy review carried out by a left-wing liberal Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he came to the conclusion that the world has become less predictable, more complex, that international relations would be demilitarized, and that the Netherlands' position would be more exposed, and that the international competition would be more about economics and technology than about military power. I think this conclusion was justified 10 years ago, but this conclusion is not justified anymore, because what I clearly see is that because of the rise of Asia, military power becomes more and more important, and this has also enormous implications for the European Union's common foreign and security policies, and consequently its defense policies. But in those days, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also thought that the Americans might not be interested in Europe at all. This proved to be false, because after a while the Americans became involved in the Balkans, in the war in the Balkans. They broke it, the Dayton peace agreement. They were active participants in the war in Kosovo. So the fear that there was a complete withdrawal from the US, from Europe, was completely unjustified. Nevertheless, we had, of course, a debate on the question: should we focus on NATO or the European Union? Should we always try to find a balance between the two? What happened in 1998 is that France and the UK they signed the agreement of Saint-Malo, and this was, of course, very, very important because this led the way to an European reaction force. The Dutch, of course, were highly ambivalent to this, but we had no other choice but to accept it. And this has, of course, something to do with the changing strategic priority of the US. What we also see is that in those days, because of Saint-Malo and the debate in the UK and France about European security and defense policies, ESDP for the Netherlands became more important. But this was always a problem because we had ministers, and like most ministers, they were not really foreign policy experts. So they fell back to the traditional notion of transatlantic relations in the Netherlands. But what you saw after a while, that each and every minister of defense and foreign affairs became more European than transatlantic, and the reason was that he or she saw that there was no other choice but to focus on European defense integration. And the reason was, of course, again, the strategic focus that was changing in the Netherlands. But in a way, not in the Netherlands, but in the US. But in a way, the new geopolitical realities required no less than a paradigm shift in security policy, because the traditional transatlantic orientation of the Netherlands became less and less important, or was weakened by the new realities. Then we went to the crisis of 2002. In April of that year, the government collapsed. We had a kind of central government. It was not left, it was not right either. It was somewhere in the center. And it collapsed because of Srebrenica, which happened 7 years before. The fall of Srebrenica, you may all know what happened there. And this caused a shock in the Netherlands, and a report was produced on Srebrenica after 7 years. And the government took responsibility, resigned, and said, okay, we were responsible for Srebrenica. We accept the conclusions of this report. And so that was the end of the government. Now, to understand what happened then is, then you should know something about Dutch politics and what happened in Dutch society. In those days, it was obvious that some of the internal policies of the Netherlands simply didn't work. Our economic performance was great, that was not a problem, but we could not deal, or the government was unable to deal with some major problems in society. Healthcare, education, traffic congestion, which is awful in the Netherlands, crime, and there was a discussion about integration. And it was obvious that new groups entering our society was changing the society profoundly. Because of this, because of the enormous challenges ahead and the importance of the questions that were being raised and the solutions that had to be developed, the much praised Dutch polder model, so the model to discuss everything until you have a decision, no longer functioned satisfactorily. So consensus seeking was not really possible anymore. There were different views in society how these major problems should be dealt with. And it was obvious that the existing political elite in the Netherlands could not solve the problems at hand. And the population came to the conclusion that the country was run by a bunch of incompetent, elitish politicians that simply could not deal with the major challenges. Whether this is true or not, that is not the question, but that was a general feeling, and that feeling also produced Mr. Pim Fortuyn. He was not a right or left-wing politician, but he was a kind of populist politician. He spoke a different language. He offered unorthodox solutions, and he wanted to get rid of the traditional Dutch political elite. And he became very popular. But he was murdered, as you may know, on the 6th of May 2002. Despite this murder, his party took part in the elections, and it gained a landslide victory. But the party was unstable, and it disappeared shortly after that. Then we had some cabinets, and they tried to go back to the past in a way, back to normal politics, back to the old traditional consensus politics in the Netherlands. But in those days, and now I talk about 2003, we also had the Iraq crisis. The Iraq crisis came almost at the same time when the Netherlands was in political turmoil. And the question was, of course, how to do with that. Now, in those days we had the Gang of Eight, led by Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar. And he took the initiative for a pro-American initiative to back its Iraqi policies. The Netherlands could not sign that letter because it was politically in crisis. It could not really take a position with respect to Iraq. What happened then is that the Netherlands came with a formula where they supported the Americans politically, but not militarily. What did it mean? Well, actually, it of course meant nothing. But it was a very interesting way of putting or formulating your position. We made no enemies, we made no friends either. We didn't choose sides, and we were acceptable for everybody. The result, of course, was that Defe became Secretary General of NATO, because Europe was so polarized that NATO could not agree on one of the candidates. And for that reason, because of the Dutch political crisis and the reason that we could not define our position in this debate pro and against the US, Defe became a good candidate. Let's say a few words on ESDP, European Security and Defence Policies. The Netherlands has always been a little bit reluctant to embrace ESDP fully. The EU was undoubtedly an important institute for economic integration, but because of our transatlantic position, the Netherlands was not sure whether this European defense integration or security integration was right for our national interest. But as pointed out, we had no other choice because of the changing geopolitical reality in the world to put more emphasis on the ESDP. Moreover, we also found that NATO was not functioning properly. The Kosovo War, we took part in it, but it also became a disappointment because the Netherlands was a faithful ally for NATO or in NATO, but at the same time, we had nothing whatsoever to say about the operational aspects of Operation Allied Force, the war on Kosovo. Harmonization of policies took place in the contact group for the former Yugoslavia, and we were not part of it. And that is something that the Dutch government in 1999 simply could not forget. Then let me say a few words on defense policies, and I will round off in, let's say, 4 minutes, something like that. Aversion to military power explains the strange nature of the Dutch debate on defense policies. Actually, in my view, a real debate has been lacking in the Netherlands. I myself was involved in the restructuring of the Dutch armed forces, and we were able to decide and to produce ideas on the restructuring of the Dutch armed forces in the early 1990s, to be precise in 1991, just after the collapse of the wall in Berlin, which had immense implications for the future of the armed forces. We could do it. We could do it in the defense staff, and it was supported by a socialist minister of defense, and it was supported by the chief of defense staff, and there was hardly any debate about it in Parliament, and that is because a real debate on defense has always been lacking. So what we did, actually, we produced a war-fighting force, a highly capable expeditionary armed force during the 1990s. It was a war-fighting force, but we sold it as a peacekeeping force. That was basically what we did as Ministry of Defense. So it was acceptable for left-wing politicians because they said, well, now we have a peacekeeping force which can deal with all the problems in the world, and this also will satisfy our moral needs. While at the same time, right-wing politicians would look at the actual capabilities of the armed force, and they came to the conclusion, well, this is essentially a war-fighting force, so it's good for us. This is a typical way of dealing in the Netherlands with nasty problems. A problem, however, was that we had to face endless budget cuts. It started in 1990 and it goes on actually until today. Budget cut after budget cut. What we did, we produced a broad toolbox of military capabilities, but over time the toolbox became smaller. We had to abolish entire parts of the armed forces. For example, get rid of our maritime patrol aircraft. We reduced the number of F-16 fighter aircraft constantly, the number of tanks, and we continued forever. There is, of course, a considerable risk involved in this this behavior. And what we see today is that because of our involvement in various operations around the world, right now also in Afghanistan, it goes at the expense of the further development of the armed forces. New missions, ongoing restructuring is okay, but the budget was not okay. And for that reason, we still are struggling with the budgetary consequences that of the decision of successive cabinets. So you have high ambitions as a country, but the problem is, of course, can you fulfill these ambitions if you do not have the budget? Now, what we now have is a kind of left-wing cabinet, and you can imagine what will happen, because left-wing politicians in the Netherlands, by definition, are more in favor of, let's say, a peacekeeping force. So what we now see is, again, a shift in favor of, let's say, a peacekeeping force, so the abolishment of more heavy weapon systems, more F-16 fighter aircraft, and what have you. The last government, before this government, for example, decided to procure cruise missiles to be able to contribute to initial entry operations in, let's say, intervention kind of operations like Afghanistan and Iraq, initial stage. And the former minister, he decided that this would be good for the Netherlands' position, because, believe it or not, we belong to the 10 to 15 most wealthy powers in the world. So what is a small country? It's certainly not a small country, but it's a powerful or economically powerful medium-sized country. And this minister decided that for that reason, because our stance in the international relations, we needed to have this power projection capability. This cabinet abolished it. Okay, let me round off by two sentences about the future. I think that the whole debate about the right balance between NATO and ESDP will be on the agenda forever. There will be an ongoing debate on whether the Netherlands need a peacekeeping force or a real fighting force. There are some lessons to be learned from Afghanistan, but also from the war on Kosovo and our involvement in the Balkans. And what we now know is that we have armed forces. We think there is clear support in the Netherlands for our armed forces. But the question is, what does it mean if you do not have enough money to support them? The big challenge, I think, is the lack of vision right now in the Netherlands, and that is because we are still struggling with the effects of this political crisis of 2002. The country has become more inward-looking. It has always been an outward-looking country, and we are now in the process of redefining our role in Europe and Europe's role in the world. And I think that is that's a good thing. So there is a discrepancy in Dutch foreign policy. At the same time, we are inward-looking politically, but at the same time, we are still activists because we are active in Afghanistan and other places in the world. let me stop here, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada. De seguida iremos ouvir o professor Hendrik Larsson, que é professor associado e titular da Cátedra Jean Monnet, leciona Política Externa Europeia, Política Externa Dinamarquesa e Análise de Políticas Externas e Relações Internacionais. É também membro do Conselho do Danish Yearbook of Foreign Policy e comentador regular nos meios de comunicação. Professor Hendrik Larsson, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Amongst the admittedly few who are interested in Danish foreign policy, it's often argued that Denmark, after the Cold War, has sided more with the United States than with the EU and its European partners. I think part of that impression comes from the Danish participation in the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan too, where Denmark has a substantial number of forces compared with its size. But it also comes, I think, from the 4 Danish opt-outs from the Maastricht Treaty, which have been carried out into the subsequent treaties, in particularly the defense exemption, which contributes to the argument that since Denmark has those exemptions, then surely Denmark must place its eggs in another basket. And the question I'm asking here in this talk is, and trying to answer too, by the way, is whether Denmark has followed the US more than the EU in foreign and security policy after the Cold War, and if so, why? So first I try to look at whether it is the case that Denmark has followed the US more than the EU and its European partners, and secondly, what is the reasons for the state of affairs I find. And let me take the bulls by its horn straight away and say that, well, actually, Denmark is engaged in EU foreign policy, generally speaking, like other member states, in spite of the opt-outs and in spite of the defense opt-out in particular. Well, what does it mean then that Denmark has that defense opt-out? Are there any implications of it? And yes, there are. Denmark cannot take part in concrete implementation of EU military actions, including the planning of them and sort of narrow political discussions related to these. And as a consequence of that, Denmark has opted out of the operations in Macedonia, in Congo, and in Bosnia, and will certainly not participate in Chad either. And it opted out of the, I think, 9 operations during the 1990s, which were carried out with reference to Article J42, and later, I think, J72 in Maastricht and the subsequent treaties. But Denmark can take part in the civilian aspects of the ESDP. And what is maybe also important here, the Danish government, in general terms, supports the ESDP development. You'll find that the language that's used is really not all that different from the EU partners. It doesn't pronounce itself that clearly on those issues, but it does take part in general debates on it. And there it would use terms like it's sensible that the EU should have a military capacity to mix its civilian capacity, and it's very sensible that the EU can undertake the Petersburg tasks and so on. So in that sense, it's not as if Denmark is totally out of the mainstream here, but it is of course the case, referring to what I said before, that it cannot take part in concrete military actions within the EU until there is a new referendum that allows Denmark to do so. The original decision was made in 1993 following the referendum over the Edinburgh decision, which, as you maybe recall, was necessary for the Maastricht Treaty to be able to be ratified, that all members were on board, so to speak. So you need a new Danish referendum for Denmark to take part in it, but and quite recently, in fact, today, the government has just announced there's going to be a referendum on the euro, but not one on the defense exemption within this parliament. So that pushes the perspective quite far ahead. But anyway, the great majority of issues discussed within the CFSP, really are not linked to the military aspects of the ESDP. And therefore I would say that Denmark takes part in EU foreign policy making like other member states, apart of course from those military aspects of this ESDP where Denmark opts out. So Denmark is engaged in EU foreign policy like other member states. I mean, the question is, of course, what does it mean to be engaged in EU foreign policy? What is a normal member in an EU of 27 members now? But you could say that there are no restrictions on Danish participation on a daily basis. And in a study that I've carried out, I actually concluded that there was no clear signs of any lack of Danish activity compared with other Danish foreign policy areas, apart, of course, from the military field. And really, across foreign policy areas, the EU is the most important framework for Danish foreign policy in quantitative terms. In a study that I've carried out, I looked at 7 foreign policy areas, and I tried to apply the model, what I found from that, to other foreign policy areas, and I found that in most cases, the EU is really the most important partner for Denmark. Sometimes it also cooperates with the US, I'll come back to that, or with the Nordic countries, or with other organizations, and certainly also unilaterally, believe it or not. But the EU is in quantitative terms the one that pops up in most contexts as the ones that you coordinate with whom positions are prepared, and so on. And that's maybe I mean that is I think an important thing if you ask about whether Danish foreign policy is conducted with the EU or the US. So turning then to cooperation with the US, then I forgot to change the overhead. Oh, yeah, here it is, the PowerPoint. Well, I mean, I'll say straight away that cooperation with the US does not cover the same broad range of political and economic issues as the EU. It's particularly strong on the military aspects of security, and I think if you were to stress some of the most important elements, you would stress the Danish participation in Afghanistan, where Denmark was there supporting the Americans from January 2002 with special forces in the Tora Bora mountains. In Iraq, where the Danes took part in the war with a submarine, maybe I am not capable of saying whether that submarine had any decisive impact in the war, but on the war. But what I can say is that the political significance of this is, of course, quite considerable, given the general European controversy on this matter. Where the Danes have been really staying on till the bitter end, if I may say so, I'll call it that. The Danish forces in Basra withdrew only 1st of August this year, and there are still helicopters deployed supporting the British forces in the south. Denmark also supported the 1998 airstrikes on Iraq, which were also controversial within the EU. The Danes, I think, were happy to provide one I think, an airplane to replace NATO aircraft that would have to take part in that operation. And then Denmark has supported the Baltic states in the 1990s. You'd say, so what? But the impact of this, or what's interesting about this is that the Americans then were not able to provide armed assistance to the Baltic states. So others could do it more easily. So the Danes did that with, I think you would say, strong encouragement from Washington. And last but not least, you'll be aware that there is an important radar station in Thule in the north of Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And Denmark has been fairly accommodating towards an upgrading of that radar, just like the British have, which, of course, can be seen as following an American policy line here.
So I think you can say that considering Denmark's size, the bilateral relationship is intensive. Now you can measure this in many ways. If you measure it in the kind of things or terms that newspapers are very interested in, then you can say, well, the number of times that the Danish Prime Minister has had lunch with George Bush in the Oval Office is very considerable. I think that is right in comparative terms. The visit to Camp David has also been, I think, it's been pointed out, is quite unusual for a country of that size, and there's an extent of bilateral cooperation that now I think is above the average within the EU. I think that access certainly also has something to do with Danish support in the war against terrorism and Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's also ad hoc bilateral foreign policy cooperation in other areas. The most important one, seen from Copenhagen, is that the Americans, during the Khartoum crisis last year, came out with a very strong statement after a few days, which the value of which should not be underestimated for solving the crisis, and where you have to say that the Americans did not have an unequivocal interest in supporting the Danes on this point, but they did. And there are ad hoc bilateral foreign policy cooperation on a number of other areas. But again, cooperation with the EU has a much more institutional character and covers more areas of foreign policy that cooperation with the US. But within the EU, Denmark, I think you can say, is one of the strongest proponents of strong Atlantic cooperation during the Danish presidency in 2002. Apart from the enlargement, which was the main priority, some said it was so much a priority that there were no other priorities. But number two was strengthening the Atlantic cooperation, and 39 proposals were put forward for how to do that. And you could even argue that to the extent that the enlargement has now been carried out, then that is the new Danish grand design for the EU, that idea about a closer transatlantic relationship. Now, how should we explain this? I think you can come up with at least three sets of explanations for the balance between the EU and the US and Danish foreign policy. And I'm not going to do any justice to any of those explanations in terms of time spent on it. My treatment is going to be very brief. And I am unashamedly going to follow the third approach. But just say that the first neorealist approach would be interested in how there were structural pressures for countries, Denmark's or others, to follow the strongest power in the system. And in some versions that would lead to a pressure for bandwagoning. In other versions that would lead to tendency towards balancing. Neorealism will often have problems in incorporating the EU. But what I think is the most sort of the strongest weakness in this context is that it is not very good at saying what kind of balance will be struck between the US and the EU. So I'm not going to go further along that path, but jump straight on to neoliberal institutionalism, where the point is that states create institutions to further their own interests. And since Denmark is not able to take part fully in the EU due to the exemptions, the logic goes, then the compensation will have to be to take part in cooperation with the US, so that Denmark is able to influence or to further its interest fully in other contexts. Now, the weakness of that explanation, although that might also have something going for it, is that there are of course also other states that have very close links to the United States, as we have talked about this morning. So I think what you're looking for is something more fundamental about the kind of relationship to the United States that's at stake. And I think that the third approach, what I call the constructivist, post-structuralist approach, is interesting here. It focuses on the dimension of meaning making. How do states make sense of the kind of context that they engage in? Who do they see and understand as their main partners? Where are their identities, so to speak, anchored? And so I'm interested in what kind of identities I could articulate for Denmark. Is that an Atlantic one, or is it a European identity? And let's see. Have I gone too far here?
Go back?
So, yes, that's the thing. Yeah, I think I'm back now. That's fine. I'll say that, well, during the Cold War, Danish foreign policy in the dominant discourse was based on 4 functionally separate cornerstones: the EC, NATO, the UN, and Nordic cooperation. And the whole point about that construction was that those they were functionally separate. You couldn't take the functions from one stone and carry them onto another. Then you get into political troubles. And it was sensible and healthy for there to be a distinction. The Nordic pillar here could, on some occasions, impose on the other ones, but then again, there are also limits to that. For example, you couldn't discuss security in a Nordic context. Now, after the Cold War, then the new dominant discourse was one where the functions of all these cornerstones were seen as coming together in the EU. And the EU was articulated as a project of peace amongst countries with common values, although the EU continued to be articulated as an instrument in Danish foreign policy. Now, you say, well, what's interesting about that? I mean, is that not what everybody's saying? Well, maybe so, but before the end of the Cold War, as I said, the EU was very much seen as having a limited role to further certain instrumental concerns in Danish foreign policy, economic and to some extent also political concerns, but a limited role all the same, and not as a community of values to which Denmark belonged for cultural reasons. If anything, the Danish approach to Europe, or Europe as a concept, European integration as a great political concept, has either been met with indifference or hostility. So I think you can argue that this is a new way of understanding things. And the present Prime Minister has spoken about the EU as the greatest peacekeeping project in history. So Danish foreign policy on this point has moved very much in the direction that you've also seen the EU taking post-Cold War. But we are not as far as, for example, France talking about a mythological project or anything of that kind. There are still substantial instrumental arguments applied. Now, the transatlantic link with the US and NATO were also, so to speak, upgraded because that got a sort of second position after the EU, which is interesting if you think about the kind of skirmishes that were in Danish foreign policy in the 1980s, where Denmark became one of the footnote nations during the missile crisis and so on. But after the Cold War, the sort of enthusiasm for NATO in the US was shared across most of the political spectrum. So, in the dominant discourse, the components were not given equal weight. The role of the Atlantic structure was stressed in relation to military security, but the EU was described as a cornerstone of Danish foreign policy. So really the EU has, after the Cold War, been the primary framework for Danish foreign policy identity. Not the only one, again, there's also unilateral action and other kinds of action, but the primary framework. But in 2001, a new government came into power. And that government, within the kind of discourse I mentioned before, articulated the role of the US as a lot more important. But that said, again, an EU white paper on priorities in Danish foreign policy from 2003 had this very important sentence: the EU is the key to Denmark's ability to influence the world around us. So let's just wait, 2003, well, that was the year of the Iraq War. So you actually got that sentence at the same time as you got Denmark supporting the EU as one of the strongest of all countries. So, and that's quite. So I think that's an important thing to underline. That thing about the EU as the key continues. But the idea about the close links to the US and how the EU and the US must be linked in a kind of common political equation is stressed even more. The foreign minister Per Stig Møller said recently that if we short-circuit the transatlantic alliance, we weaken our possibilities to protect and further precisely our joint ideas in a world where too many threaten these. So, in other words, it's certainly a question of influence, but it's also a question of values. And the American link is certainly strongly articulated as a part, much more strongly articulated as a part of Danish identity post-2001. In an important article which the Danish Prime Minister published in the Washington Post before a meeting with George Bush in 2002, there were so many markers of identity squeezed in that it was hardly possible to squeeze any more. Long historical links, gratitude for the US for helping Europe in the 20th century, strong loyalty towards and solidarity with the US, common values and destiny, common understanding of the challenges of the world today, in particular the fight against terrorism. I mean, the only thing you're really looking for there is a reference to the history of the English-speaking people. But that was, of course, Churchill's important book, but that, of course, would be a bit difficult. But nevertheless, that's the only thing you couldn't squeeze in there. So that there is a very significant articulation of the role of the US in Danish foreign policy identity. But we've got to add to this that post-2004 and 2002, there was also a new foreign policy doctrine, let's call it that way, which has to be linked to the to this sort of stronger identity element of the US to understand fully what's happened. All Danish governments post-1989 have said that they conduct an active foreign policy. Again, you'd say, so what? But that's a very important distinction from the period before '89, where the idea of not upsetting too many and sheltering behind important other powers was an important element of it. But the post-2001 government articulates a different from the previous governments, also the governments after the Cold War, in that the idea is that Denmark should be directly engaged in the defining issues in its national politics and security, and give unequivocal support to the leading powers in the struggle, if necessary, by military means. And there was this willingness to go all the way in Iraq, for example, also in Afghanistan, which was new, and which was almost made a moral issue. I think in some ways comparable to the kind of argument you would find Tony Blair using in relation to Iraq. It wasn't just a question of gaining influence in Washington, it was a question of taking part in the right kind of struggles fully. And in that exercise, in distinguishing itself from previous governments, some funny and interesting references were made. For example, the government said that we got to break with a tendency that goes all the way back to the Second World War of not fighting. Denmark should have stood up stronger against the Germans in 1940. And that's, of course, very, very long lines. And to kind of formulate a foreign policy that's in opposition to something 60 years ago, it's long historical sweeps here. And it goes out saying that it also distances itself from the footnotes in the 1980s. There's also an interesting and exciting domestic agenda, because when you say you want to be directly engaged in the defining issues, you also say that the third way that was very common amongst Nordic countries during the Cold War, this idea that there was a choice between strong capitalism and socialism. If you break with that, then you're also really breaking with a kind of model that previous social democrat governments have propagated in foreign affairs, but also in domestic affairs. So there's also a kind of domestic side to this, where this thing about taking strong choices is also pushing politics in a more, in this case, liberal direction. So Anyway, this active foreign policy is also carried out in the EU. That's at least the way the government understands it. But the trouble is, of course, that it cannot be applied to the EU only, because if you really want to take part in the big defining issues of international affairs, and the EU can't do that because the EU is split, there's only one place you can go, and that's further west. So in other words, the EU is clearly not framing the context of Danish foreign policy in the same way as before. Now, coming to the conclusion, you can say that Danish foreign policy is actually strongly Europeanized and is not, if you remember the question I asked from the beginning, conducted with the US as the most important partner. That conclusion, of course, assumes that you don't take military issues as defining for everything else. That you think that you need to take the total picture in. I mean, if you think military issues are defining, then of course the US is the most important partner. But I think that would neglect, in fact, the majority of all foreign policy activities. But when this is so, that's because the EU is our most important alliance, the key to Denmark's ability to influence the world around us. And there's not so much a downgrading of the EU post-2001 as an upgrading of the US. And part of this is really the offensive foreign policy, as I've explained, gaining influence through the US, through the EU and the US, taking clear sides on defining issues, willingness to support the EU on the military ones. Now, it maybe goes without saying that this line has not been uncontroversial domestically. And the question that's being asked, by the way, very much in parallel to the debate in the UK, is whether the influence that's gained through the US is really the right kind of influence, whether it's worthwhile, whether it's a good idea to accept the US definition of what the main struggle is in international politics. And because this is controversial, I would say that the balance that I have just explained to you between the US and the EU and Danish foreign policy is not a permanent or a stable one. But it's not one that's going to change either straight away, because a week ago the government won the third general election. It's kept its majority, but it's a smaller majority. It's actually a majority that's supported on one member from the Faroe Islands, who's got to be given a lot of side payments to go with the government. So I think that the EU line, which the centre-left focuses on, is one that is going to be stronger in the time to come. But even if there is a change of government, where I think that the balance will be different towards the EU, it will still be a government that will allocate a very strong role to the US, while the EU remains the cornerstone of Danish foreign policy.
Tivemos duas interessantes intervenções sobre uma perspectiva holandesa e uma perspectiva dinamarquesa sobre questões de política externa e de política de segurança, com alguns aspectos que por vezes se assemelham ao caso português, nomeadamente as questões da neutralidade, de uma recentralidade que evolve de um alinhamento preferencial com a Aliança Atlântica para um alinhamento mais próximo da Europa. E abríamos então um pequeno período de debate até sensivelmente às 5 para as 4, depois faríamos um pequeno intervalo e retomaríamos os trabalhos logo de imediato às 4h05. Portanto, está aberto um período de debate, se quiserem colocar algumas questões.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask Mr. Larsen why he thinks that the government elected in Denmark right now took the decision of having a referendum only on the euro and not raising the rest of the issues of the Maastricht Treaty.
Good afternoon, Miguel Freire. I'd like to address a question to Professor Rob Defe. The Portuguese government decided 2 or 3 weeks ago to pull out its size level unit from Afghanistan. Apparently, this was done without a public debate, or even the government, the Portuguese government, didn't give a clear reason to do so. In a time when NATO is asking for a more commitment towards Afghanistan. What I'd like to ask you, sir, is with the Dutch traditional anti-militarism posture, how has the Dutch government been able to convince the Dutch people to have their armed forces suffering casualties and fighting a hard battle in South Afghanistan? Thank you.
Mário Nogueira. Professor Rob Defe estava preocupado com o problema da mudança social na Holanda. Como é que isso afeta as decisões em relação à política de segurança? E para o professor Larsen, eu queria perguntar sobre a questão da identidade atlântico-europeia.
Okay, now, could you repeat the question, please? Because
Perdeu-se a tradução.
Para o professor Larsen, eu queria questionar acerca do problema da identidade atlântico-europeia, haja visto que a Dinamarca foi um império e continua sendo um império económico.
The first question is a very interesting one about the Dutch government being able to gain the support of the population for our involvement in Afghanistan. That is really a good question. What is happening, or what has happened, is that the Dutch government sold this as a reconstruction mission to the population. The debate in Parliament is still, especially on the reconstruction element, while in practice we do most of the time, we carry out a war fighting mission most of the time. This is, I would say, a typical element of Dutch policies. That is, you do not really have a debate on the real issue, a political debate on the real issue, but you talk about those elements you are willing to talk about. Probably this is the case in quite a few other countries as well, but it is especially strong in Europe. So we have a debate primarily on the reconstruction part of the mission, and the debate we have right now on the extension of the mission, and next week the government will take a decision on this, mainly focuses on the success we have with that reconstruction part of the mission. This is, in my view, a problem because it makes you very vulnerable for public opinion if there is no reconstruction whatsoever. And at the moment there is not really very much reconstruction going on because it's a fighting mission. And if you have to take casualties, then and you can't explain why it is in the interest of the Netherlands to stay in Afghanistan, then this will really weaken public support for it in the end. So far, so good with respect to Afghanistan, because next week the government will take a decision on the extension of our mission, and if I'm not mistaken, there will be an extension of the mission by another 2 years. But again, the focus is on the reconstruction part of the mission, and only very few people in the Netherlands talk about the war-fighting part of the mission. I'm one of them, and I always explain to the Dutch public that it's in our interest, because if we do not fight the Taliban, then Al-Qaeda can use Afghanistan again as a sanctuary, and I would say that is not very good for our interest. And this also holds true for the rest of the world, I would say. Now, you also mentioned the decision that was taken by the Portuguese government to withdraw. I think it's a commando element, if I'm not mistaken, from the south of Afghanistan. We regret that very much. I can say it here. We regret that very much because we are in desperate need in the south for more capable troops, and commandos really play a big role. If I'm not mistaken, the Portuguese force element was part of the strategic reserve of Commando South in Commando South of ISAF, so it was quite important. We are now looking for other nations that can team up with us in Uruzgan, that is our province in Afghanistan, and that is difficult. And it's a European problem because we simply can't find additional forces in Europe. In Europe, we have approximately 50,000 to 55,000 troops that can be deployed at once. We have in total, we have some 150,000 deployable troops in NATO, which is, in my view, a shame if you take into account that we have 1.5 million men and women under arms in Europe. But we can only deploy 50,000 at once because we need the other 100,000 in reserve for rotation. And we have deployed right now some 55,000 troops. So there is a shortage of troops right now. So everything that is withdrawn is a problem and creates a bigger problem in the south of Afghanistan. Now, with respect to the second question, social change in the Netherlands and the impact on internal security, I'm not entirely sure if I understood the question correctly, but if I'm not mistaken, and if I understand your question correctly, then I would say that okay, the country is in political turmoil. There is some social unrest. Things are not as bad as they were, let's say, 2 years ago. But on the other hand, things within the government and within the bureaucracies, things are pretty normal. With respect to internal security in the Netherlands, all the policies are well in place. The Netherlands has now very strong anti-terrorism policies. There is now a new national security strategy. And what you see in my country is that despite all the problems we have in the society, the major policy initiatives simply take place. They do take place. I already discussed the way we transformed the armed forces in the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, there was hardly any debate on it. We now are transforming the entire internal security sector in the Netherlands, and again, there is hardly any debate on it. So we are very good in implementing huge programs of change in my country without much political debate. One explanation is that there is consensus seeking behind the scenes. So if there is consensus within the government and among the ministries, then it simply will happen. And the second is that we, in my view, have a very weak parliament which has no clue what's going on. So there is very little debate in parliaments on these monumental changes that are taking place within government. Let me stop here, Chairman.
Can you hear me? Does it go through? Yeah, okay, fine. Well, first on the question of why the referendum on the euro as the only one. And I think what you need to say is that almost ever since the 4 Danish exemptions were voted for at the referendum in 1993, the successive governments have started being against them, and have said on most occasions that, well, yes, of course, we got those exemptions, but we think they're detrimental to Danish interests. So you have to ask the question, well, if that's so, why doesn't the government then, or didn't the government then take the initiative to organize new referenda to get rid of them? Well, there's 2 things to be said about it. First of all, that there's got to be a majority seemingly for getting rid of them. And as you maybe know, in relation to the Euro referendum in 2000, the judgment was wrong then, which makes you a bit careful about, if you're a government, about when to call a new referendum. But just as importantly, then The 1990s and of course the years after the change of the millennium have been marked by a whole succession of treaties within the EU, and the risk, it was thought by successive Danish governments, was that the debate about whether there should be Danish exemption would be mixed up with a debate about whether Denmark should accept the treaty changes. Because, and that's because people could rightly say, well, if we're voting yes or no to whether to keep the referenda, well, it's exemptions in which treaty then? What does that mean for the whole ensemble? And therefore, there was always a treaty in the way. And what's happened now is that with reform treaty, that the same kind of argument has been around, that you couldn't have a vote on the referendum on the exemption because if there's going to be a vote on the reform treaty, then that will mix things up. But I suspect, I wasn't there yet, but I suspect what's happened is there's been a legal opinion from the Ministry of Justice, which is decided in this respect, which has concluded that there's no need for a referendum on this issue because there's no abrogation of sovereignty, which is not a surprising conclusion because the German presidency did everything it could to get rid of the things that would trigger off a Danish referendum. So it's not surprising, but now they know. And that means that it's relatively risk-free to put one of the exemptions at least to a new referendum. And I think that the reason why the euro is chosen is because that's the one that's easiest to explain to people, that the consequences are clear. I mean, if you go abroad, you see that you have to change your money now. If you go, you don't have to change your money if you get the euro. Whereas the defense exemption or even the exemption in justice and home affairs is very complicated to explain. And also, you might know that the present Danish government is very hard on immigration and would actually want a very selective interpretation of the exemption in home affairs. So a political debate where some people say you are not willing to go far enough, and others will say it shouldn't be cancelled at all, would be a dangerous debate. So that's why I think the euro has been chosen. But again, the 2002 experience, before the referendum, there was the majority of 60% for in the polls, shows that maybe the government's logic here is not necessarily going to be carried through. About Denmark and the transatlantic relation, or the Euro-Atlantic relationship. Well, there's little doubt that that in all countries, in one form or other, there's a debate about what the weight should be between the two pillars. And of course, in no case is it a choice. We're talking about the weight here. And there's no doubt here that the Danes are very strongly on the side of a strong link to the US, but it's also the case that a change of government could change that. And I suppose the same is the case in other countries where we know that these things is a left-right issue. So I suppose that's one of the things that might actually make it difficult to carry through political initiatives in that field, that they are also subject to the political conjunctures in every individual country.
Defe e Professor Larsen, pedia que nos acompanhassem na salva de palmas os oradores. Muito obrigada.